Henry David Thoreau met only a handful of people during his lifetime. He almost never left his hometown, and wrote only 2 major works, one of them a dismal failure. Yet his voice has stood the test of time to capture our imagination today, 150 years later. Who was Thoreau, and what was his unique vision at Walden? What did his life and writings reveal about himself? And what do they reveal about us? Henry's grandfather emigrated to America about 1773 and settled as a merchant in Boston. He made his fortune in the profitable sugar and molasses trade and married Jane Burns, of Scottish and Quaker descent. He retired to peaceful Concord, where he died from tuberculosis in 1801. He was 47. His son John, Henry's father, was not so lucky in business. He lost the family fortune in a series of business disasters. In 1812, he married Cynthia Dunbar in Concord. Cynthia was a tough-minded, passionate woman who did not hesitate to speak her mind. She also had a generous heart, often inviting strangers into the house, and, as an abolitionist, allowed many runaway slaves safe passageway in her home. John was her opposite. Serious, aloof, she overshadowed him. He grew deaf in his later years, and was said to be something of an onlooker in his own home. The newlyweds lived in this house on Virginia Road. In 1812, Helen, their first child, was born, John in 1814, and on July 12, 1817, Henry David Thoreau was born. But they did not stay long. Henry's father had trouble earning enough money. After several failed business ventures, he tried sign painting, then taught in Boston. Finally, in 1826, lured by a friend's offer to try pencil making, the Thoreaus moved back to Concord for good. Ironically, it was while in Boston that Thoreau visited Walden Pond for the first time.
When I was 5 years old, I was brought from Boston to this pond, away in the country. That woodland vision for a long time made the drapery of my dreams. That sweet solitude my spirit seemed so early to require.
Thoreau wasn't much of a student in his early years. Like most boys, he delighted in staying home from school and exploring the New England countryside. He later wrote,
I remember how glad I was when I was kept from school a half a day to pick huckleberries on a neighboring hill, all by myself, to make a pudding for the family dinner. A half day of liberty like that was like the promise of life eternal. It was emancipation in New England.
In his later manuscripts, he mentions one incident where he was chased out of a blueberry patch, and he was kind of quizzical about it. He didn't know what the heck was going on, and he mentions that this fellow, I can't remember the gentleman's name, but chased him out of the blueberry patch, and Thoreau went jumping over walls and that sort of thing to get away from him. This was when Thoreau was 12 years old. And then he mentions in these late manuscripts, he said, that was the first time it ever occurred to me that blueberries could be private property.
Henry was close to his mother, but was closer still to his older brother John. The two often set out on adventurous river journeys, camping, and hunting expeditions. He led a boy's life, and he would look back on it with great fondness.
I think that no experience which I have today comes up to or is comparable with the experiences of my boyhood. In youth, before I lost any of my senses, I can remember that I was all alive. The earth was the most glorious musical instrument, and I was audience to its strains.
In time, Henry entered Concord Academy, a private school where he learned Greek, French, arithmetic, and prepared to enter university. At age 16, Thoreau was accepted into Harvard University. This was a source of pride to his family, most of whom never went to college. On September 1st, 1833, Henry entered Harvard. He had taken the road from Concord to Harvard to find the truth and gain a profession. But nobody knew, not even Henry, that it was the road from Harvard to Concord that would be of far greater importance. Henry had his father's retiring nature and soon slipped into obscurity with only occasional oddities noticed about him, like wearing a green homespun coat to chapel instead of the traditional black coat the rules prescribed. He took courses in rhetoric, Latin, and Greek. He spent most of his time alone and was a frequent visitor to the university library. While at Harvard, the pivotal moment came when Thoreau read an essay entitled Nature. Written by a certain Ralph Waldo Emerson, it was as if Henry was peering into a mirror. He recognized so many insights and convictions that could have been his own. The words on the page seemed to come from the very thoughts in his mind.
The reason why the world lacks unity and lies broken and in heaps is because man is disunited with himself. Build, therefore, your own world. As fast as you conform your life to the pure idea in your mind, that will unfold its grand proportions. There is a property in the horizon that no man has, but he whose eye can integrate all the parts. That is, the poet. This is the best part of these men's farms. Yet to this truth, this warranty deed gives no title.
These were the words of a kindred spirit, and Thoreau heard the clarion call. He had read the first words of a man who would guide the principles and very course of his life. In 1837, Henry returned from Harvard to Concord, but he had no idea what he wanted to do. He announced that he wanted to be a poet, but poetry doesn't pay the bills. His parents urged him to be a teacher, and in September, he took up teaching at the local Concord public school. But it wasn't long before Henry ran into trouble. After only 2 weeks of teaching, Thoreau was confronted by the village education committee, who insisted he use corporal punishment against the students. Henry disagreed, but relented. But when he later caned 6 of his students, he was so sickened by the experience, he walked out of the classroom and never came back. Yet Henry was not discouraged. If he could not teach the way he wanted at the public school, he would open a school of his own with his brother John. Not only would there be no corporal punishment, it would be a school unlike any other.
I don't know too much about pedagogical theory. I do know that there are schools in the United States nowadays called Montessori schools and those sorts of things where there are kind of unconventional educational techniques. The Thoreau brothers, many people regarded them as one of the harbingers of this kind of activity, where they would take their classes out in canoes. They would collect samples. They would study toads. They would study frogs. And that was apparently a very large component of their curriculum, which was extremely unusual at the time. But it was something that almost always came up when the students who were going to their school grew up. They always mentioned that it was such a wonderful experience going out with these two fellows. Of course, they did have the standard, a lot of their students went on to Harvard, and all of them knew Greek. And, they were, in addition to doing these field trips and having these sort of unconventional teaching techniques, they did, of course, do the standard reading, writing, and arithmetic.
They had 25 students with a sizable waiting list. One of their students was Louisa May Alcott, who would write the great American classic, Little Women. It was the summer of 1839. Times were good. The brothers had just finished their first year running the school and were on a boating trip together. John was in love with 17-year-old Ellen Sewell, a friend of the family. Henry was also in love with the same woman, but he kept this a secret. John courted Ellen for a year, then asked her to marry him. She refused. Now, it was Henry's turn. He began a correspondence with her in which he persuaded her to give up both coffee and tea as an experiment, an odd way of pressing a romance, but he also sent along original poems. In June, Ellen came to Concord, and Henry used this opportunity to grow closer.
The other day, I rowed in my boat a fine, even lovely young lady, and as I plied the oars, she sat in the stern, and there was nothing but she between me and the sky.
In November, he proposed to her. Ellen refused him.
I wrote to Henry Thoreau that evening. I never felt so badly at sending a letter in my life. I could not bear to think that both these friends whom I have enjoyed so much would no longer be able to have the free, pleasant intercourse with us as formerly. My letter was very short indeed, but I hope it was the thing.
Henry was crushed. He seems never to have taken an interest in women again. He would be a bachelor all his life. At about this time, Thoreau was getting acquainted with a circle of intellectuals who called themselves the Transcendentalists. Their leader was Ralph Waldo Emerson, an ex-Unitarian minister whose essay, Nature, had influenced Thoreau while at Harvard. Their favorite meeting place was Emerson's house, where they would have many lively discussions and debates. The Dial was their quarterly journal, where they put their philosophies into writing.
Transcendentalism was, in one sense, a very local movement growing out of New England Unitarianism. It was a reform movement within Unitarianism that grew out of dissatisfaction with the excessive concern with ceremony and with logic and with a worldview largely associated with John Locke that said that religion is approached through rational means. Emerson was one of those ministers who was dissatisfied, and he wanted to emphasize that religion was a matter of internal experience of God.
It's very difficult to define American transcendentalism. It's kind of a literary, quasi-religious, religious in an unorthodox sense, that really they were very interested in answering the question how to live. They were very interested in what they called self-culture. They were very interested in high thinking and simple living.
I think of transcendentalism as in many ways a spirit of the age. It was a generational matter of dissatisfaction with the way things had been done, a dissatisfaction with institutions, with the older generation, which is why the transcendentalists are especially of interest during certain times of crisis in later periods of our history. The transcendentalists themselves referred to their movement as the newness. It was reflecting their sense that things were being explored and discovered and asserted really for the first time in American culture.
In this study, Thoreau became a frequent visitor and offered several pieces to the Dial. But more importantly was his budding friendship with Emerson. They had been together in Emerson's garden. Emerson had much to teach Thoreau as a well-traveled man and greatly respected essayist. Yet Thoreau had things to teach as well, for as Emerson tended to dwell on the metaphysical principles of nature, Thoreau had a great knowledge of nature's tangible side. And so the two took long walks, Emerson expanding on transcendentalist ideas, Thoreau initiating him into nature's inner secrets. But good fortune would not last. John's health was failing. The onset of tuberculosis was punishing his body, draining it of energy. The school was a success, But in the spring of 1841, the brothers were forced to close the school. Henry's spirit was restless. What was he to do? None of the professions interested him. It was then that Emerson offered him to stay at his house while he was away lecturing in Europe. Thoreau would maintain the house and garden and look over the family, and in exchange live there free of charge. Life was pleasant living in the Emerson house. While he went about fixing broken furniture or chopping wood for the stove, his thoughts first turned to Walden. In December, he wrote,
I want to go soon and live by the pond, where I shall hear only the wind whispering among the reeds. I don't want to feel as if my life were a sojourn any longer. It is now time that I begin to live.
But tragedy put an end to the peace. In February 1842, Henry's brother cut himself while shaving and died in Henry's arms. It was a shock, and Henry grieved long in his heart. John was his closest friend on earth.
Then one day, John was shaving and cut his thumb with a razor, and at the time, the razors were made out of whatever it is, iron, I suppose, that causes lockjaw, and he died just like a week later, and he died in an excruciating death in Thoreau's arms. And within a very short period of time, Thoreau himself developed what's called sympathetic lockjaw. In other words, he saw John die and he saw the symptoms, and Thoreau, developed those very symptoms himself. It's a sympathetic illness, which is unusual, but not unprecedented.
Henry grew more isolated and more restless. To get away from Concord, he accepted a tutoring position in New York and lived there for a year. But the whole time, his heart ached for Concord, for never was there a man less suited for city life. Upon his return to Concord, he moved back into his parents' house and worked in his father's pencil shop. At this time, a calamity unfolded that would set many townsmen against him for the rest of his life.
One windy day, Thoreau was out sailing with Edward Hoare. I think the gentleman's name was, or Ebenezer Hoare. I can't remember the guy's name, but he and a friend were out sailing, and they decided to stop near Fairhaven Bay and make a fish chowder. They built a fire, weren't careful enough to make sure that the fire would be contained, and it spread, and they couldn't stop it. Thoreau, he writes a very, very long journal entry explaining in detail what was going on, and he mentions that he ran here and he ran there and he did this and he did that. But once it became clear that the fire was completely out of control, he says, oddly, that he went up onto a cliff or a hill overlooking the fire and just sat and admired it, which some people take to be, as a very cavalier sort of attitude. But again, I think it was just simply yet another one of the things that made Thoreau's neighbors look askance at him, and there were quite a few things.
And so it was. In the spring of 1845, in the aftermath of the fire, the disillusionment of the city, Thoreau turned his efforts to building a cabin by the pond that he would make his home.
Near the end of March 1845, I borrowed an axe and went down to the woods by Walden Pond, nearest to where I intended to build my house, and began to cut down some tall white pines for timber. The hut was 10 feet wide by 15 feet long, with a large window on the side, a door at one end, and a brick fireplace at the other. In the front was 2.5 acres of beans.
On July 4th, 1845, as citizens everywhere celebrated their country's independence, Thoreau moved into his cabin. Why did Thoreau retreat to the woods, and what did he wish to accomplish?
I think what we have with Thoreau is a young man, graduated from college, in a time when almost nobody graduated from college, who had not quite found the guiding clue, and who really wanted to kind of confront himself and looked upon the Walden experiment as a chance to finish to finish the book that he had started that would memorialize his brother. That's certainly one of the things he planned to do. But also to really finish, if you'll pardon me putting it this way, to finish his education.
He's doing this not to be Spartan and to live without, to show that he can live in a kind of a self-punishing manner, but really that he can have time to appreciate what's really glorious and beautiful in life without the encumbrances of civilized life. He's writing at a time when Concord itself is undergoing a transformation from an agrarian bartering economy to a really commercial economy. The railroad has passed through by Walden Pond a year before Thoreau goes to live in his house by the pond. And I think he's trying to reflect on these economic shifts in the culture of America that really he's foresightful enough to see will create major changes in the landscape of America, and to reflect on what this means for him personally.
Channing said, you need to go out there and wrestle yourself. And I think that's, at the most basic level, that's what he was doing. He was going out there and finding out who the hell he was.
I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. I did not wish to live what was not life. Living is so dear. Nor did I wish to practice resignation unless it was quite necessary. I wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life, to live so sturdily and Spartan-like as to put to rout all that was not life, to cut a broad swath and shave close, to drive life into a corner and reduce it to its lowest terms. And if it proved to be mean, why then to get the whole and genuine meanness of it, and publish its meanness to the world, or if it were sublime, to know it by experience and be able to give a true account of it in my next excursion. I do not propose to write an ode to dejection, but to brag as lustily as a chanticleer in the morning, standing on his roost if only to wake my neighbors up. When I wrote the following pages, or rather the bulk of them, I lived alone in the woods, a mile from any neighbor, in a house which I had built myself on the shore of Walden Pond in Concord, Massachusetts, and earned my living by the labor of my hands. I lived there 2 years and 2 months.
One message in Walden may be that a life of happiness could be found in simplicity, deliberation, and kinship with nature. Simplicity. If people could just simplify their lives to what they really needed, Thoreau reasoned, they wouldn't have to labor so hard to maintain what they had. Simplicity was like a key to liberation.
Most men, even in this comparatively free country, have no time to be anything but a machine. Still, we live meanly like ants. Our life is frittered away by detail. Simplicity, 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 I say. Let your affairs be as 2 or 3, and not 100 or 1,000. Instead of 1,000,000, count half a dozen, and keep your accounts on your thumbnail. Why should we live with such hurry and waste of life? We are determined to be starved before we are hungry. When we are unhurried and wise, we perceive that only great and worthy things have any permanent and absolute existence, that petty fears and petty pleasures are but the shadow of the reality. Let us spend one day as deliberately as nature, and not be thrown off the track by every nutshell and mosquito's wing that falls on the rails.
Communion with nature was also important, for Thoreau felt that in witnessing its transformation and timelessness, we somehow discover more about ourselves.
When the snow lay deepest, no wanderer ventured near my house for a week or fortnight at a time, but there I lived, as snug as a meadow mouse. The great snow, how cheerful it is to hear of. No weather interfered fatally with my walks, for I frequently tramped 8 or 10 miles through the deepest snow to keep an appointment with a beech tree or an old acquaintance among the pines. We have such a habit of looking away that we see not what is around us. How few are aware that in winter, when the earth is covered with snow and ice, the phenomenon of the sunset sky is double. The one is on the earth around us, the other in the horizon. The millions are awake enough for physical labor, but only 1 in a million is awake enough for effective intellectual exertion. Only 1 in 100 millions to a poetic or divine life. To be awake is to be alive. I have never yet met a man who was quite awake. How could I have looked him in the face? The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. What is called resignation is confirmed desperation.
One of the hardest things for people to, I think, approach in Walden is its tone. Once you get past the misconception that Thoreau was a misanthrope who didn't want any part of society, the next thing that people have a hard time, especially younger readers, accepting is the often moral tone that Thoreau takes in Walden. He can be very preachy. He can be very demanding in what he expects you to do with the insight that he's imparting to you. And that doesn't fly very well with today's generation that does not like to be preached at. Walden has some beautiful descriptions, but it's also a very moral document. I think that there are elements of the sermon, certainly of the lecture in Walden, where Thoreau wants you to imbibe a moral that he has lived through himself and wants you to share.
Thoreau has a very, very high standard that he articulates in his writings. And it makes, I think, a lot of us feel kind of, here's this guy who's, like you were saying, preaching to us all the time, and, did he really live up to what he was preaching? Well, I don't think he did, and I think he knew he didn't. In fact, in his late lecture, Huckleberries, which he was writing before he died, he says, hey, look, I'm not only complaining about you, I'm complaining about my own way of life and the way I live. But it's the attitude of the artist who's saying, here's how we should live, as opposed to, here's how I live, and therefore you should live like this.
I find it wholesome to be alone the greater part of the time. To be in company, even with the best, is soon wearisome and dissipating. I love to be alone. I never found the companion that was so companionable as solitude. If a man does not keep pace with his companions, perhaps it is because he hears a different drummer. Let him step to the music which he hears, however measured or far away.
Students love to tell teachers about the hypocrisy of living alone in a cabin and then going to your mother's house for meals or going to the Emerson's house for cookies. And I think there's nowhere in the book where Thoreau says that he intends to put these pleasures behind him. He means simply not to be burdened down by the things that keep you from finding out what's really important. And he's never advocating rejecting friendship.
In the American psyche, Thoreau is a hermit. Anybody who's been out to this landscape knows that you can walk from downtown Concord to Walden Pond in like 20 minutes, maybe, if you're a fast walker. He was not out in the middle of no place. He was not a hermit. He delivered several lectures while he was at Walden. He had runaway slaves stopping in at Walden. He was on the Underground Railroad. His family came out. He talks in Walden about giving picnics at his place. He has that wonderful sentence about, it's wonderful. He says, it's astonishing how many great people a small house will hold.
Silence. Silence is audible to all men, at all times, and in all places. She is when we hear inwardly, sound when we hear outwardly. Creation has not displaced her, but is her visible framework and foil. There are from time to time mornings, both in summer and in winter, when especially the world seems to begin anew. The world has visibly been recreated in the night. Mornings of creation, I call them. I have always been regretting that I was not as wise as the day I was born. Time is but the stream I go a-fishing in. I drink at it, but while I drink I see the sandy bottom and detect how shallow it is. Its thin current slides away, but eternity remains. I was suddenly sensible of such sweet and beneficent society in nature, in the very patterning of the drops, and in every sound in sight around my house, in infinite and unaccountable friendliness, all at once like an atmosphere sustaining me. Every little pine needle expanded and swelled, was sympathy and befriended me. I was so distinctly made aware of the presence of something kindred to me that I thought no place could ever be strange to me again. Every day a new picture is painted and framed, held up for half an hour in such lights as the great artist chooses, and then withdrawn, and the curtain falls. And then the sun goes down, and long the afterglow light, and then the damask curtains glow along the western window, and now the first star is lit, and I go home.
While living in the hut, Thoreau wrote A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers that described the river journey he had taken with his brother John when they were schoolteachers together. He dedicated the book to his brother. Even in Thoreau's hut, the world's troubles were not far away. In 1844, James Polk was elected president, and Texas was sure to be annexed as a slave state. This disturbed Henry greatly. Henry was on his way to town to pick up a mended shoe from the cobbler, but on the way he met trouble. For several years he had not paid his poll tax, for he did not want to, quote, trace the course of his dollar till it buys a man, or a musket to shoot one with. While he paid his highway tax for local expenses, he refused to contribute to a government he found unjust.
So Sam Staples didn't want to have to pay Henry's tax, so he went and told Henry, I need you to pay the tax. And Henry said, I'm not going to pay because I don't believe in what the government is doing. So Staples, not wanting to pay himself, apparently it was in violation of the law, but nonetheless he grabbed Thoreau and threw him in jail. Of course, word got around and somebody, likely Thoreau's aunt, went and paid the tax. Would he have stayed there? Absolutely. I'm absolutely convinced that he would have stayed there on principle. Thoreau stayed there the night. Staples goes in the next morning with the key, unlocks the door, tells Thoreau, you have to leave, somebody's paid your tax for you. Thoreau refused to leave. So he said no, he wanted to make a statement. And finally Staples had to kick him out.
This event, though relatively unimportant at the time, became the inspiration for a later essay entitled Civil Disobedience. After 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days, Thoreau ended his experiment. On September 6, 1847, he left the woods for good.
I left the woods for as good a reason as I went there. Perhaps it seemed to me that I had several more lives to live and could not spare any more time for that one. I learned this, at least, by my experiment, that if one advances confidently in the direction of his dreams and endeavors to live the life which he has imagined, he will meet with a success unexpected in common hours.
After leaving the pond, Thoreau needed somewhere to go. Emerson again offered his house, as he was on another lecture tour to Europe. Thoreau accepted. It was in this house he also developed a deep friendship with Emerson's wife, Lydian, who was very ill and confined to her room for weeks at a time. Thoreau wrote to her,
I shall not hesitate to know you. I think of you as some elder sister of mine, whom I could not have avoided, a sort of lunar influence, only of such age as the moon, whose time is measured by her light. You must know that you represent to me woman, for I have not traveled very far or wide, and what if I had?
It was 1851, and once again the cares of the world knocked on Thoreau's door. The Fugitive Slave Law had just been passed, which meant that even in free Massachusetts, if a black man was discovered to be a slave, he was to be arrested immediately and returned to his owner. Anyone failing to turn in a runaway slave was a criminal. In 1851, Anthony Burns was arrested in Boston as a runaway slave. He was forced back into servitude. The case made headlines, and a controversy erupted. Should Northerners who abhorred slavery be forced to return runaway slaves? For answers, Thoreau returned to his earlier essay, Civil Disobedience.
When a sixth of the population of a nation, which has undertaken to be the refuge of liberty, are slaves, and a whole country is unjustly overrun and conquered by a foreign army, I think it is not too soon for honest men to rebel and revolutionize. If it is of such a nature that it requires you to be the agent of injustice to another, then I say, break the law. Let your life be a counter-friction to stop the machine. What I have to do is to see, at any rate, that I do not lend myself to the wrong which I condemn. Under a government which imprisons any unjustly, the true place for a just man is also a prison.
Thoreau soon had his philosophy put to the test. He came across Henry Williams, a runaway slave, who had escaped from the plantation in Virginia to become a waiter in Boston. But the police were searching for him in Boston, so he fled to Concord. The Thoreaus put him up at their house, as they had done for other runaway slaves. Meanwhile, Henry secured passageway to Canada, where Williams would be a free man. The next morning, while police were milling around, Thoreau escorted Williams to the depot, where he made a successful journey to Canada. In 1857, a man showed up in Concord to meet with an abolitionist. His name was John Brown. Pro-slavery men in Kansas had attacked and pillaged the town, and in retaliation, Brown and his men killed 5 pro-slavery men in the name of the Lord. Brown was taken by a friend to have dinner at the Thoreau house. Henry was very impressed with Brown's candor and boldness. He later attended a talk he gave on the Kansas affair and what needed to be done. All this would have consequences later. On the night of October 16th, 1859, John Brown and his men raided Harper's Ferry. He was arrested the next day and sentenced to death. When the news reached Concord, there was a loud public outcry against Brown. Everyone denounced his actions as barbaric, but Henry felt deeply that Brown's attempt was heroic. It was an issue that would occupy him the rest of his life, for it got to the heart of civil disobedience and individualism.
It's very important to understand, and Thoreau's title for the essay that he wrote, the lecture that he delivered, was a plea for the character of John Brown. It wasn't a plea for the actions, and Thoreau was very careful to make the distinction between the character of John Brown and John Brown's actions. What he was saying was that John Brown's character, his reliance upon principle, was a thing that we should respect. And Thoreau compared him to Christ. I mean, it was really, it really upset an enormous number of people.
Thoreau organized a talk in the Unitarian Church and tried to defend Brown's actions.
What was Brown thinking? What could he expect to gain?
You who pretend to care for Christ crucified, consider what you're about to do to him who offered himself to be the savior of 4 millions of men.
Do you condone killing, Mr. Thoreau?
I do not wish to kill, nor to be killed, but I can foresee circumstances in which both these things would be unavoidable.
A couple of years later, when huge numbers of New Englanders were marching south during the Civil War, all of them very, with great deal of glee, really, and pride, sang John Brown's Body. Every damn person in the northern part of almost every person in the northern states came to see John Brown as a hero.
As the years went by, the friendship between Emerson and Thoreau began to unravel. They were going their separate ways in philosophy and life, and were becoming less understanding of the other. The unraveling can be found all too clearly in their journals.
Talked, or tried to talk, with Emerson. Lost my time, nay, almost my identity. He assuming a false opposition where there was no difference of opinion. Talked to the wind, told me what I knew, and I lost my time trying to imagine myself somebody else to oppose him.
Henry is military. He seems stubborn and implacable, always manly and wise, but rarely sweet. Henry does not feel himself except in opposition. He wants a fallacy to expose, a blunder to pillory, requires a little sense of victory, a roll of the drums to call his powers into full exercise.
Never a natural or simple word or yawn. It produces an appearance of phlegm and stupidity in me, the auditor. The conversation comes to naught.
Always some weary paradox to fight you with, and time and temper wasted.
Emerson, as he was going into senility long after Thoreau's death, there's a record of him asking his wife one day when he was probably suffering from what we now call as Alzheimer's. He asked his wife, "Who was my best friend again?" And she said, "Henry." And he said, "Oh yes, Henry." So there's no question that they were extraordinarily close all their lives, but they had some difficulties, as anybody would.
In December 1860, Thoreau caught a cold that soon turned into bronchitis. He was forced to stay in bed for months. The winter passed, the spring came, and he was no better. It seemed like a cruel punishment for one who so loved the outdoors to be confined to a room. On the 3rd of May, he wrote to a friend,
I am still as much an invalid as when you and Brown were here, if not more of one. And at this rate there is danger that the cold weather may come again before I get over my bronchitis.
The time came when Thoreau knew the end was not far. He would soon go the way of his brother and father before him.
The winter is coming when I shall walk the sky.
He was dying, but he kept his spirits up to the end. Realizing the seriousness of his condition, his Aunt Louisa asked,
Henry, have you made peace with God?
I was not aware that God and I had ever quarreled.
On May 6, 1862, the man who had once inhabited Walden Pond died. His work, Civil Disobedience, was an essay heard around the world. In 1908, a slightly built lawyer borrowed from the library of a jail where the British had him locked up a volume containing Civil Disobedience. The man was Mahatma Gandhi, and this essay would set the tone for his long march toward liberation for the Indian people. In the 1960s, another imprisoned man read the essay and was influenced profoundly. Thoreau's work has influenced nature writers like John Burroughs and has helped give a voice to the environmental movement. He lies buried in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery at Concord, but his voice lives on.
Ah, I have penetrated to those meadows on the morning of many a first spring day, when the wild river valley and the woods were bathed in so pure and bright a light as would have waked the dead. There needs no stronger proof of immortality. All things must live in such a light.